Welcome back. The country's infrastructure is in shambles, and it's the economy that keeps suffering. From roads and rail networks to water pipes and power stations, little seems to be working well. Did the post-apartheid government address town and spatial planning to redress infrastructure shortcomings, or did it simply ignore this? Who must be held accountable? Now, let's discuss this now with Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance, William Gumede. Professor, thank you for joining us at eNCA. I guess that first crucial question of who must be held accountable is at the fore. What's the root cause? Because we understand roads, rail and ports all in disarray.
Good evening. I'm very grateful that you invited me. Yes, we are now seeing what we've seen in many other African countries in the post-colonial system. So 60 years after the end of colonialism in the rest of Africa, the infrastructure in most African countries is now, now worse than it was during colonialism. Now it's the same now in South Africa. Our infrastructure now is worse than it was during apartheid. Who is to blame? Is the current government is to blame, and the current government must take responsibility for it. What has happened is, like in many other African countries in the post-colonial period, the government did not invest in the post-apartheid period in infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is so critical for development. Without infrastructure in a modern world, one cannot have development. So that's the first oversight, the lack of infrastructure expansion and development. The second thing is the lack of maintaining existing infrastructure. And then the third element was then the capture of infrastructure, by appointing cadres without the skills, giving procurement to politically connected companies, and then those companies and they get infrastructure contracts without the skill set, produce poor new infrastructure, and then the poor new infrastructure breaks down almost immediately, and then the old infrastructure is not maintained either, and that is what we now have, a double whammy of infrastructure collapse, where we're on the verge in South Africa now of the whole system of public infrastructure collapsing.
And what needs to be done, Professor? You mentioned a double whammy of the infrastructure collapsing. Do we now need to revamp the infrastructure in its entirety, or what needs to happen?
What we need to do now is, clearly the state on its own right now does not have the capacity to manage the country's infrastructure on its own. So that is the reality. We have to accept the reality. Now, if we don't accept that reality, then we will continue with poor infrastructure. If we allow the state, with its lack of capacity, with its procurement corruption, because procurement corruption cannot be changed overnight, because it's politics. The people who get the contracts, who don't have the skills, they connected to the ANC, to government, they cannot be fired because they're part of the political system. So that's state capacity will continue, and also at the same time, many people who work in government overseeing the assets of infrastructure, they may not have the skills. So what we now need to do is to bring in the private sector, in public-private sector partnerships to build our infrastructure. And then thirdly, what we need to bring in ordinary citizens, and civil society must watch over infrastructure. How should they do it? For example, at a community level, we now need, communities to form, forums where they can watch over the deliberate destruction of infrastructure. Secondly, communities and ordinary citizens must go to state-owned entities and attend AGMs and hold the state-owned entities in charge of infrastructure responsible for the appointments of executives, the appointments of boards, so that incompetent people are not appointed. Because if incompetent people are appointed, they cannot play oversight over infrastructure, and infrastructure collapse. Then the communities and civil society organizations at a local level must also watch over the people who would destroy infrastructure. And then, lastly, as a society, we must respond against people who, during protests, against service delivery or wage protests, destroy infrastructure. Because that is all part of the package of the destruction of our public infrastructure.
Do we have an estimate, Professor, of just roughly how much it would cost to just maybe revamp and fix the infrastructure woes of the country? Because already we know in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, the damage there was in the billions, of course, at the hands of the floods. Do we have an estimate of how much we need as a country?
It's obviously very difficult to make these calculations, but we go back to what happened in KwaZulu-Natal during the floods. Because the infrastructure was already collapsing, the impact of the floods were even more severe. So more people died because the infrastructure was already depleted or defective. So when we get more storms and more disasters, we will have more destruction, as you know. Back on the KwaZulu-Natal issue, for example, if tenderpreneurs build weak infrastructure and the weak infrastructure don't last, and then there comes, we have an emergency, a disaster, then we have, more people dying. And we have more destruction of property. If it was solid infrastructure that had been maintained and of a high standards and looked after by capable people, less people would have died in the floods, and it would have been less destruction. So, that's just one example of the cost of not looking after our infrastructure, of not maintaining of our infrastructure, and the corrupt management of our infrastructure and appointing incompetent people to manage our infrastructure.
All right, Professor William, thank you very much. That's Professor William Gumede from the Wits School of Government.